Yeah, so Rethink Economics work is...
Gustavo, do you want to... Who is this?
Okay, sorry. So Rethink Economics work is a society at work that tries to put forward a more pluralist curriculum and yeah, push for a more pluralist economics discipline. It's a branch of Rethinking Economics International. Yeah, hopefully this discussion will...
Thank you. Yeah, I think we can wait for one more minute for Fadhel. Perhaps there is an issue, but after that one, we can talk about this event. All right. Still, Fadhel hasn't joined us. So I think it's better to start because if we want to wait a little bit more, we are not sure we have Fadhel. Okay, so I start. Hello, everybody. We have a session about the future of the global economy. We have a discussion about global sustainable development goals, which was introduced by the United Nations in 2015. We had, hello, Fadhel. Thank you for joining us. So in 2000, we had a Millennium Development Goals, and in this Millennium Development Goals, we tried to, all countries decided to actually follow some follow some goals and reduce some problems, specifically about the hunger, about mental health, also developing and cooperating between developed economies and developing economies, promote gender equality, and etc. We had some success, and also we had some failures reaching to those Millennium Development Goals. After 2015, there was another summit in the UN in 2015, and 193 countries agreed on different types of goals, but including those goals we had in Millennium Development Goals. Now the number of goals reached to 17, from 8 to 17. So the focus was on poverty, hunger, health, education, and quality of the education, women, gender discrimination, clean water, clean energy, employment, economic growth, inequality, consumption and production, cities and communities, peace, justice, undeveloped institutions, and environment. All these things now are included. So since 2015, we have reached or we had progress in some of those goals, but we haven't reached to any of them yet. So this event is to discuss about what we are doing. Can we reach to those goals or not? Is it possible under the the current world economic situation, is it possible for us to think about these goals? When we reach to 2030, do we need to think about another kind of summit, another 15 years to talk about? So in this panel, we have 4 guests. Professor Tony Addison is a professor of economics, University of Copenhagen, in Development Economics Research Group. He was a chief economist and deputy director of UNU Wider in Helsinki, Finland. His research interests focus on extractive industries, oil, gas, mining, and their development impact, the political economy of economic policy, as well as post-conflict reconstruction and poverty reduction. He has recently co-edited the open access book, Extractive Industries, the Management of Resources as a Driver of Sustainable Development, published by Oxford University Press. And also we have Professor Fadhel Kaboub. Fadhel is an economist at Denison University and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He has held research affiliation with the Levy Economics Institute and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is an expert on modern monetary theory, the Green New Deal, and the job guarantee. His work focuses on public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global south, build resilience, and promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. Also, we have Dr. Timothée Parrique. He's an economist and his research has been on the political economy of degrowth. And the implication of the idea of degrowth. He is the lead author of Decoupling Debunk, Evidence and Arguments Against Green Growth. And he frequently writes about green growth and post-capitalism. And also we have Mrs. Magali Brosio. She's a doctoral researcher at the Birmingham Law School, working at the intersection of gender, law, and international development through a feminist perspective. Magali is the lead advisor on inclusivity and diversity at Young Scholars Initiative Institute for New Economic Thinking, as well as a coordinator for their Gender and Economics Working Group. Thank you, all of us. Thank you, all of you, to come to this event. And let's start my question from Tony, if it is okay. So the first question we have is this one. What were the principal reasons behind the failure to meet the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, proposed in 2000? Considering this experience, what are the sources of optimism regarding our reaching the SDGs by 2030? Yeah, please.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. I think one should start by recognizing that the MDGs, its establishment was an achievement. There had been various sets of international goals up to 2000. But certainly for those in the UN system, it did, represent an institutional achievement getting that far. And if you remember the politics of the time, it was fairly unproprietous for doing that. It was the Bush administration in the United States. Certainly there was a lot of pushback from the Bush administration. Also surprisingly from some other governments. So it was something of an achievement to get those goals out there. And it did actually provide a useful framing for a policy, because we can look back in the period of 2000 to 2015 as actually a growth in official aid, including official debt relief. Not enough, for sure, but we had the Gleneagles G8 meeting, and we had various financing initiatives put in place around the MDGs. So, you know, that was that was an achievement. In terms of the 8 MDGs themselves, it's a bit much of it's a rather a sort of glass half full, glass half empty story, which is, you know, the income poverty goal as it was set out in the MDGs was achieved, although a very large amount of that was, of course, due to China. And with the SDGs as well, one of the big problems is, you know, not so much the achievements in places like China, as good as they are, but achievements in, you know, the low income countries, and particularly the fragile states, as we call them, which are the very problematic ones. MDGs, there was an improvement in girls' education. It's said that it met the target. My personal view is we're still way, way behind on female education, again, particularly in the fragile states and low-income countries. Malaria, TB, we did quite well on in the MDGs, drinking water, sanitation, and so forth. Now, in some ways, you know, the goals were quite low bar. You know, the income poverty goal is low bar, and it's the same case in the SDGs. And, you know, we could have a whole conversation all day about setting international poverty levels. And there is a big debate goes on about that among researchers. To a degree, you could say that modest goals were set because there was an effort to get everybody on board around these. And it is quite an achievement, you know, to get the world community to sign up to these things, including the SDGs themselves. The big failure under the MDGs, of course, was carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases. And that's just a massive failure of the last, well, 20 years, 100 years, however far one wants to go back. And there's been a lot of, you know, missed opportunity there. You know, we look back now coming up to COP26, and I just think if so many of the things that are now on the table at COP26 have been put on the table 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you know, we really are very, very late on this. Inequality, we didn't think enough about inequality in the MDGs, and that's come back to haunt us, particularly, I think, over the last 5 or so years, and that applies not only to the developing world, but also, obviously, to the developed world. And I think intellectually, you know, this is a meeting hosted by Rethinking Economics. And we come at economics from various sort of different perspectives. And I think intellectually, the last 20 years, it's been interesting intellectually, but I think we've also had something of a little bit of a failure. You know, and I apply this to economists myself. I mean, I come from a mainstream economics background. Many of my views, friends would tell me, were heterodox if I could only kind of pitch it in that direction. But I think as economists, we haven't necessarily done very well. It's not necessarily for kind of bad reasons that, you know, the MDGs pushed a lot of emphasis onto service delivery and improving education, health, sanitation and safe water, where I've said, you know, we've actually had some real achievements there. So economists got very, very engaged in evaluating the effectiveness of service delivery. You know, are we reaching the poor? Are we using the best mechanisms to reach the poor, et cetera, et cetera? You know, are we getting more than $1 worth of poverty reduction from $1 worth of investment in the social sectors, right? And we had the rise of randomized control trials and other evaluation methodologies. Now, again, you know, we could run a whole meeting on, you know, RCTs. They have their fans, they have their critics. But I think one problem with the whole ethos of development economics and the way it went was it tended to take attention away from the productive side of the economy. It tended to reduce livelihoods just to, you know, poor people generating livelihoods for themselves through things like microfinance assistance from NGOs and so on. And I don't want to denigrate any of that. You know, we've had some massive achievements. You look at, say, BRAC in Bangladesh, you know, superb work with particularly the chronic and ultra poor. But as economists, we haven't thought through the shaping of economies in the ways that we used to do. And this is going right back into the 70s and 80s when I was trained, when I was first looking at development economics. When I first went off to Tanzania in 1980, which was my first experience of development, working in development country, you know, we had enormous debates around the structure of economies and how we move the structure of economies along. And I think you can see that, for example, in the fact that compared to 2000, most low-income countries, and indeed most low middle-income countries, are as dependent on commodities, unprocessed commodities, and the export of those unprocessed commodities as they were in 2000, that is today. So, you know, we haven't actually achieved that much diversification of economies. In agriculture, you know, you could say that African agriculture, yeah, we've had some bright spots, but, you know, the yields are still very low. You know, we haven't had the breakthroughs in agricultural surpluses that we really want to, you know, raise production and end hunger in Africa. So I think intellectually, you know, we've been a little bit narrow. And, you know, as I say, you know, the MDGs, it's partly all about service delivery. We want to improve education. You know, we want to get education and health out to girls and women in particular. How do we do that? You know, so, you know, you can't blame people for wanting to do that. And many of the people who do work on it, you know, extremely concerned about, you know, the fate of the ultra poor. But I do think intellectually, it's been rather weak. And of course, that's particularly so on the environment and climate side, where I would argue actually climate is still not mainstreamed in development economics as it's mostly taught. And I say this, you know, somebody who's been working on the extractive industries, oil, gas and mining, which obviously have enormous climate dimensions. On the SDGs, I think we would be very lucky if we were to achieve the targets that were set out by the target year of 2030. I mean, the report by the Secretary General that came out, I think it was in June this year, you know, details how off target we are. We know that COVID last year pushed 140 million people back into poverty. The hunger story is not good news, although fortunately we've been saved by some reasonable harvests. But, you know, I really fear a food price shock. And I think as the global economy recovers, you are going to see some stress in food systems. And we know that, you know, hunger transmits itself very fast, in very fast ways into poverty. And of course, you know, we have the big monster of climate change. So you were looking for grounds for optimism. I think the grounds for optimism are, first of all, we have a generation of new thinkers, such as the people in Rethinking Economics, which is a great initiative. We have people willing to push intellectual boundaries. To a degree, we have technology and science. You know, the renewables revolution has pushed the price of renewable energy down to levels that we would not have expected even 5 years ago. And of course, the COVID pandemic has demonstrated what you can do with science. I could think of plenty more reasons to be pessimistic, but I think I'll sort of conclude my opening response on a little bit of optimism there. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think after this 2015, we realized the problem of development, global development, is much deeper, and we face much crucial issues. That is why perhaps we moved from 8 goals to 17 goals, and we included some other goals. Perhaps we realized there are some very complicated issues behind all these goals. It's not achievable easily unless we sort out some of the other issues. Now, my question is from Fadhel, if it is possible to tell us, do you think we are in a right track? Do you think we can reach to those goals in 2030, considering all the facts around us? Thank you.
Well, thank you again for the kind invitation and for organizing this wonderful event. The short answer is no. Unfortunately, I'm a pessimist on this, and I'll explain why. And I agree with Tony that this is primarily a failure of economic thinking, and I'm glad that we're having this discussion in the context of rethinking economics. For a number of reasons, one of which I think I'll leave to Timothée. I'm sure he'll discuss later, which is the implicit assumption that we can only achieve these goals with more economic growth in the narrowest sense of the term. So I'll leave that aside because I think Timothée will do a great job in opening this discussion for us. But I'll zoom in on some of the failure of the economics profession in terms of rethinking the process of economic development in general. And if I may share my screen, I'll show you just one example. I don't know if I can share screen. I'll just pick a random country here just to illustrate Bangladesh for the sake of argument. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that we have an extractive economic development model that traps developing countries decade after decade in a process of external debt accumulation, debt denominated in foreign currencies. And when you have that, you have to think about it. What's the reason behind this massive accumulation of external debt, despite economic growth and increases in income and everything that we hear about all the time? And you realize it's really the composition of economic production that developing countries typically specialize in or have been forced to specialize in. I think I can share my screen right now. Hopefully I'll share the right PowerPoint. Let's see here. And I think you can see the Bangladesh exports composition here. Notice the volume of exports, $42 billion. This is from 2018. And now I'm going to flip and show you the imports composition. You can just eyeball the types of industries that a country specializes in, and notice the volume of imports. So you have a structural trade deficit, and you look at the root causes of this structural trade deficit, you recognize that it's typically three sources for most developing countries. One is the lack of food security or lack of food sovereignty. Number two is the lack of energy sovereignty or energy security. And number three, which is what we have on display here, is the fact that the value added content of what developing countries export tends to be low. It's like an assembly line type of manufacturing system. And the value added content of what they import tends to be high, which means no matter how fast you accelerate your growth, no matter how fast you accelerate your international trade targets, you're always going to be structurally deficient. And that translates into the following picture, which is this structural trade deficit widening gap between imports and exports eventually translates into a rising level of external debt denominated in foreign currencies. And that ultimately puts pressure on your exchange rate. So when your currency is weaker relative to the dollar, to the euro, to the British pound, it forces the country into a set of choices. You either let your currency depreciate, which means everything you import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine, is going to be more expensive. So you're literally importing inflation. You're going to have food riots the next morning. And we've seen this happen in several places, including in my home country, in Tunisia. The other choice is to prevent that social unrest and instability and protect the most vulnerable from food price inflation and so on, and to accumulate more external debt, which now sets you in this continuous trap. And you're told by the economics profession, by the international financial institutions, the credit rating institutions, that the only way to get yourself out of that external debt trap is to grow faster and to accelerate your economic machine. Well, here's what happens when you accelerate your economic machine. You're given a few choices. You can promote tourism to bring dollars and euros into your economy and create jobs and so on. Well, the problem with tourism, if you bring 10 million tourists a year, like Tunisia, or 12 million tourists, you have to feed them. So you import even more food, and you have to heat and cool the hotels for them and transport them. So you have to import even more energy. And there goes your trap, right? Option number two, you can accelerate, promote your exports and promote foreign direct investment. Well, it looks like a solution in the short term, but it's a trap in the long term, because number one, you have to import more energy, you have to import more intermediate goods, more technology, more capital, and you're always exporting low value added content, racing to the bottom, competing with another 150 countries on lower wages, on lower prices, and so on, or specialize in literally extractive industries such as mining. And that includes, by the way, the developing countries who are net exporters of crude oil, for example, oil and gas. Well, guess what? They export crude oil and they import the higher value added content, petrochemicals and gasoline and kerosene. So not having the refining capacity is also part of that trap historically. Not that I'm trying to promote more oil and gas extraction or refining. I'm hinting to the solutions here, which is food renewable energy investments in the global south, and more investments in food security, especially in sustainable agriculture. And the long-term solution on the industrial front is to focus on industries that promote resilience and that promote higher value-added content, so that you're racing to the top, not racing to the bottom. And you can only get there by investing in education, research and development, infrastructure, public health, all the things that you're told you can't afford until you pay your debt, right? And this is part of the long-term trap. So this is kind of in terms of zooming in on a country situation and identifying that the so-called solutions that promote growth and promote external foreign currency reserve accumulation, these are long-term structural traps. Now, if you look at the much bigger picture, especially on the issue of climate change here, if you net out all global transactions between global south and global north, the latest data we have tells us that the global south is sending $2 trillion a year to the global north, net of all foreign direct investment and charity and donations and remittances, all of those things. So when you put the challenge of climate change on the table, when you put all the other challenges of economic development on the table, the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs, we're not going to put a dent in this thing if we globally have an international trade, an international finance system that's constantly sucking $2 trillion a year from the global south. The number 20 years ago was something like $500 billion a year when I was in grad school. Today, it's $2 trillion. If we don't do anything about this extractive engine that we have, if we simply accelerate the engine, we have this conversation in 10 years, the number is going to be $15 trillion a year, maybe. This unsustainable, economically, socially, politically, ecologically unsustainable. So what we need to be thinking about is not accelerating the engine and hoping for better results, but changing the engine altogether. So we want an engine that doesn't produce inequality, that doesn't produce more CO2 emissions, that doesn't produce more socioeconomic exclusion. We want an engine that by design produces more equitable outcomes, more sustainable outcomes. And that requires rethinking economic theory and economic policy. So simply accelerating the same processes that we've had in place for a number of years and saying, well, the obstacles are corruption, the obstacles are, this and that. Well, of course, we know corruption is a problem. We know that there are some obstacles in the system, but it doesn't mean if we get rid of corruption today and we have democracy all over the world, that we accelerate the system and it's going to give us better results. We have to recognize that part of the corruption we have in the system is built into the design of the processes that we have in place. I'll give you one example to illustrate, and maybe we can discuss it further. When you think of food security, there are movements all over the world, all over the global south, pushing for more sustainable agriculture, promoting native crops and so on in my own home country. And the opposition to those movements tends to come from political and economic sources of power that have vested interests in importing key food commodities. Because if you're the main importer of wheat for the country, why would you want the natives to produce domestic food security and take away your rent-seeking behavior, right? So you're going to promote your position with political influence, with economic influence, and in some countries, in some cases, with violence against people who are trying to promote more sustainable agriculture. The same goes in so many other areas of economic activity domestically. So corruption is part of the process for sure, but it doesn't mean that if we get rid of corruption and we allow the same oligarchical powers to continue the extractive industries and accelerate extractive industries, that we're going to have better results. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
That's great, Fadhel. Thank you very much. Based on what Fadhel says, we cannot actually accelerate this kind of view about economic growth, and we need to design a new kind of engine. So in this case, we've reached to another question. Is degrowth is the solution for us? Timothée, can you please answer this question?
Yes. So that's perfect. I think Fadhel just built the ground perfectly for the argument I'm going to lay down here. And it's going to sound fairly radical, but the SDGs in the way they're designed today are unachievable. Within capitalism, outside of capitalism, with any kind of system, economic system you want, you will not be able to achieve all the SDGs together. So why is that? Because there's a contradiction between some of the goals. And the one I'm going to focus on is mainly SDG 8 and the fact that it focuses on economic growth. And just before, because one of the weaknesses of the SDGs when we think of the 17 goals is that it's a bit like a laundry list, you know, we have all of them like this, but it's really rather a hierarchy. And I'm gonna, there's this figure from the Stockholm Resilience Center made by my colleague that they call the wedding cake, you know, where they're putting 4 SDGs linked to the environment, you know, climate action, life in the water, life on land, clean water. They put this at the base. And then you have the social and societal SDGs. And then you have the economic SDGs. So if you fail to achieve the environmental SDGs, you will fail to achieve all the rest. That's for sure. And, you know, if you go on the SDG dashboard index website to check the advancement of the SDGs, and there's been the SDG report published recently, you will see that these 4 environmental SDGs are doing terrible. Climate action, life in the water, I mean, it's a real disaster. You look at the map, it's red everywhere. So these, we've not done any progress, and the situation is actually deteriorating on many aspects. So why is that? The claim I've been trying to show through my research is because, and I think Fadhel have been introducing this aspect as well, as we have in high-income country been creating an extractive engine. So what we measure as GDP growth in the North and what we're trying desperately to decouple from environmental degradation is actually dependent on the extraction of many resources from the global South and the emissions of many pollutions also with impact in the global South. So we remember one of the target of SDG 8, I think I've got it here. Yeah, target number 4, endeavor to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. So decoupling is the idea we can keep having a rising GDP, but disconnected from the use of resources and the impact on the environment. That's the idea of green growth that we know have on many international organizations and many governments. Fact is, scientifically, this decoupling, we don't see it. And I say this very seriously. There's been the first review of literature taking into account every single empirical study of decoupling since the concept exists in the 90s. It's 835 studies, almost 1,200 analysis. And what does it say? It says, well, most of the places in the world have not managed to decouple. And the one that have, they've managed relative amount of decoupling, so relatively more efficient, but total impact is still rising. Most of the time, that's only temporary for a couple of impacts, maybe for carbon, maybe for water pollution, but never for all impact together. And even in the very few countries in the world that have managed to achieve a few years of absolute decoupling, maybe when they undergone an energy transition from one energy source to another, even these countries reduce their emission by almost nothing, a few percent. Top decouplers, we're talking 1-2% max. Compare this to the type of decrease we need to match the Paris Agreement, and we need double-digit emission reduction. Here I'm only talking about carbon, but that's even worse for biodiversity, for the material footprint, for water pollution, for the usage of land, all the type of stuff that are not being discussed in green growth, because the green growth discussion is a bit obsessed about carbon. Even that carbon, we're not managing at all to invert the trend. So now, I mean, the SDGs were 2015. We're 6 years after. I think it's time to update the scientific knowledge and to admit that we're not going to manage to decouple GDP growth from environmental pressures. That's just extremely unlikely and absolutely unlikely in the very decade where most of these actions need to be done. So now that's my first opening statement. It doesn't even matter. We're not talking about capitalism here. Even if you had, global communism or the best planning or eco-socialism, still, if you have a growing economy measured as rising GDP, you will have growing environmental degradations. So far, that's what's been happening in the histories of human economies. But now let me switch to a second argument to show that capitalism is a particularly bad system to meet the SDGs. It's one system that is, let's say, one of the worst to achieve that goal, which is, we can call it degrowth, which is to, let's say, have this big transition from the goal of decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation to the goal of decoupling human well-being from environmental degradation. This is not rhetoric. This is one of the most important shifts in the history of economics, to admit that the definition of prosperity, that economic growth can actually sometimes be counterproductive to the achievement of human well-being. Here, of course, it's very easy to show that that happens to environmental degradation. So the benefits of economic growth, which are appropriated by those that are already rich. We know this also empirically. Economic growth is a very poor strategy to reduce poverty. And in the SDG as well, there is no talk of redistribution. It's like when you look at SDG 10 on inequality, the target points like the poor people just need to be growing faster than the rich people, and somehow that's going to even it out. I mean, ask any 5 years old, what's the solution to poverty? And I think you'll get a better answer than this one, which is precisely, take from the rich, give to the poor. So the SDG is also a bit too vague about this. But now let me point to why capitalism, I think, is partly unfit to the task. And here we're not going to get caught in defining what capitalism is about, but let me give you a few features, at least to make sure, we're not too abstract. When I'm thinking of capitalism, I'm relying on the predominance of a few institutions, the private concentration of means of production, and the private ownership of whatever is produced in these companies. The predominance of wage labor, the pursuit of profits, and having markets as a main mean of allocation. So that's kind of the definition of capitalism. So the question is capitalism adapted to fill the SDGs? Is capitalism a good system in a time of social ecological emergency? 1 year ago, you would have asked me this question that would have been very theoretical, but there's been the pandemic. So now let's look empirically, what did we do during the pandemic in a situation of social ecological emergency? Did we just say like capitalism is going to solve it? Let's just wait for the market to just produce a vaccine and distribute it. So far, we've been doing part of this, and we can see on the distribution of vaccine, a shocking situation. If you look at a map of vaccine distribution, you will see that most of them are in high-income countries that have been hoarding them. It reminds me, of those pictures you see when taken with satellite during the night, and you see points of lights that also in the global north that we use to show like patterns of unequal exchange of, you know, the global north extracting energy and materials from the global south. Same thing, Fadhel was talking about financial flows. Now we have a new flow to keep track of, the flow of vaccine. Doses being sucked up in the north, patent being retained in the north. High-income countries only contain 19% of world population, and yet they've bought 54% of all vaccine doses available up to now. So here we really show what happens when you let capitalism just handle a social problem. It does it in a very unfair manner. But now let's look at what did individual country do. Individual country acted, I think, against the basic rules of capitalism with price controls on hydroalcoholic gel, for example, in France, on specific quotas, on not, you know, expecting us to decouple hugs from virus spreadings through technological development, but through, you know, precautionary principle, geste barrière, you know, preventing, you know, decreasing physical interaction in the meantime for us to find a vaccine, in the meantime for us to better organize, following the principle of precaution. So now I'm thinking, okay, we've done this for the pandemic, and now we're resorting to discussing climate change, and we're using a complete different mentality. Why is that? I think it's only because the pandemic strikes us as, you know, an immediate fear, and climate change and, you know, biodiversity loss and the death of oceans and, you know, irreversible land change leading to, you know, a loss of fertility, all of these stuff do not seem that threatening, because also the rich people have the capacity to protect themselves against it. So to conclude, I think here we need to use a word, and that word is planning. So my answer is, we need not only, of course, to ditch capitalism as a system. I think this is why I like to research post-capitalism. I think so now the pandemic and the failure of the SDGs has shown that we need to try something different. We know this. Whatever that different is, we don't quite yet know, and there are many different options, but we know it needs to be something different. That's the first point. And the second point is that whatever that system is, it cannot be a system centered around the pursuit of economic growth. Let it be socialism, communism, eco-anarchism, you know, a new form of capitalism, whatever you have. Again, that's like a biophysical constraint. If it's growing, it's going to be a problem. Here, it's not only theoretical, it's going to be a problem because it's going to prevent us from meeting the SDGs. So it's going to be a poverty, a gender equality, a democracy problem. I'll start with this and we can continue in the discussion.
That's great. Thank you, Timothée. There are also some kind of political pressure on political leaders if they want to actually follow degrowth view. So they have to answer the nation about, for example, other issues like, for example, unemployment, about even economic growth and other things. So we need to think about that one as well. But we put that one away just for a second. We come back to the idea of degrowth and new economic policy and other political pressures we have for countries to compete with each other in this global economic competition. So my question from Magali is about the role of financial institutions in forming and shaping our economy and the global economy, not just the national economy, the global economy. Can you please add something in this case?
Yes, of course. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. And it is a pleasure to kind of kickstart the conversation on the role of IFIs in sustainable development. So I think it is at this point a very well-known fact that the role of the UN as the dominant voice in international development has been increasingly challenged by Bretton Woods institutions. This is not new. It has been happening at least since the 1990s when IFIs kind of try to push the UN to focus mostly on peace and security, claiming greater technical expertise on development. But it has become, in a way, more acute lately. And I think that there is now a common understanding, and I would also say fear that power has or is indeed shifting towards these new spaces. And I think there are mainly two interesting channels through which IFIs kind of like exercise power in the realm of development. And they are not, of course, they are in a way related, but I think there are two distinct ways. What is measurement? I think that the ability to introduce universal ideas of what is normal or desirable through indicators that I think in turn also hide, their underlying assumptions behind this kind of veil of objectivity or scientific knowledge, and at the same time kind of shield, like this more theoretical or ideological core. So IFIs have been very successful in promoting their own ways of like measuring other countries against the benchmarks that they created, and using this as a soft power tool of governance. And the other is, of course, conditionalities or the strings that are attached to the loans that countries have to keep asking them for. And I think that at a general level, this is very problematic because, well, many things, but first of all, I would say that IFIs are not well known for their democratic practices, in the sense that not all countries can participate on equal grounds as they can do in the UN, or at least in the General Assembly, and they are much more hostile to civil society participation. So as a consequence, I would say that the strategy that many progressive groups, including civil society organizations, have implemented in the last decades of advancing progressive demands through multilateral negotiation, it's kind of threatened by these new landscapes. And I would like to take some minutes to talk a little bit about the gendered implications of this kind of involvement of IFIs in the idea of development, or in the reconceptualization of what development is. Because even though some of these organizations have moved at least partially from the more hardcore, let's say, neoliberal ideas, they are still very fond on conditionalities, including what we know as austerity measures. And again, it is a very well-known and well-documented fact that austerity measures affect women disproportionately. And I'd like to spend only a few minutes kind of unpacking the channels through which this happens. So first of all, women are more likely to lose their incomes in the event of austerity policies. On the one hand, we all know that most economies are characterized by what is known as horizontal segregation. That is, that women tend to concentrate around certain kind of employment or jobs. In particular, they tend to be very highly represented in the public sector, but in particular in health, in education, in social work, etc., which are all sectors that tend to be targeted when public spending needs to be reduced. In the same way, women tend to be more likely to be receiving social protection in the way of social transfer or welfare benefits, which again are likely to be reduced in the event of austerity measures. Secondly, there are a lot of gender-specific services that tend to be shut down under these conditions. So I'm thinking about access to sexual and reproductive services, access to contraceptives, access to abortion, etc. And also different institutions that tend to protect women who are victims of gender-based violence. So for instance, shelters that are in place to protect women that are victims of inter-partner violence. And last but not least, we have, of course, women's unpaid care work. So as I said, or as you probably know, women tend to be in charge of most of the unpaid care work that is done globally and that supports the whole economy. And when the state kind of withdraws from providing public services, women tend to step up and cover and fill that gap. And many scholars have been very clear in underscoring that it is important to acknowledge that this is not an accidental byproduct, but these austerity measures are implemented under the assumption that women will do this, will be the variable that kind of moves and covers this. So at the expense, of course, of their own time and at the expense of having less time to do paid work, to educate themselves, but also to leisure, contributing to what's known as time poverty. And at a more general level, I think that it is also important to consider how IFIs have become more and more interested in gender equality in the last decades, and how this kind of interest has led to a reconceptualization and instrumentalization of what gender equality is. So think about the emergence of the idea, for instance, of women's empowerment as smart economics. You probably have heard about this idea that, oh, women are under untapped resources. They have this entrepreneurial spirit. They just need someone that invests in them. And in this movement, the idea and the importance of gender equality as an end in itself, it's kind of subsumed to the importance of it as an end in itself is kind of subsumed as a means to achieve economic growth once again. And I think that the most interesting and worrying consequence of this approach is of what some feminists have called the neoliberalization of feminism, is that leads to the promotion of measures that allow women from the global south to be part of the global labor force. So for instance, we have a lot of measures that allow them to ask for credit to start their own businesses, that push for them to be able to migrate, to be domestic workers, to be able to work in textile factories in free trade zones. But they're only able to be included in the global labor force insofar as they allow, only in ways that allows capital to benefit, from this or profit from this inclusion. And I like to connect this just as I wrap up with the MDGs and the SDGs more generally. So Tony, in his initial intervention, talked about the missed opportunities, as I think that the case of gender equality in the MDG framework was actually more than a missed opportunity. It was received as a retrogression by the feminist movement. So by the time, so the MDGs had a standalone goal on gender equality and women's empowerment, that was MDG 3. But when you look at the targets, the only target that was under that goal was the target on reducing inequality in primary and secondary education. So that was a very narrow understanding of what gender equality is. And at that point, when the Millennium Development Goals were adopted, the women's movement had a long history of advocating inside the UN and had made significant gains in those past decades. So the MDGs were received as a retrogression and more importantly, as a potential destruction of the priorities that they themselves have identified in the 4th UN World Conference on Women and have articulated in the Beijing Platform for Action. And I think that these MDG 3 kind of reflects this spirit of this neoliberalization of feminism, this idea that gender equality, yes, that's kind of important, but insofar as it helps women to enter into the labor force in very specific and gender ways. SDG 5 on gender equality, on the other hand, is much more comprehensive, it's much more broad, it has a lot of targets that cover a lot of areas that were part of the Beijing Platform for Action and goes even beyond. It talks about access to economic resources, it talks about unpaid care work, it talks about gender-based violence, about sexual and reproductive rights. And of course, the language is not amazing, but it's definitely and qualitatively different from what they had at MDG 3. However, and then again, I'd like to connect this with the role of IFIs. So you probably know that IFIs did not have a very concrete or or explicit role in the negotiation process, because the UN is at the end of the day an intergovernmental space. So the goals were mostly shaped in what is known as intergovernmental negotiation among government representatives. But the IFIs did have a role, in particular the World Bank, in the selection of the indicator framework. And I argue that they have pushed, specifically in the case of gender equality, I haven't done research in other areas, but I'm sure it's the case. They have pushed for a reduction or reconceptualization of the achievements done under the goals and the targets through trying to kind of propose indicators that kind of narrow down the focus. So for instance, in the case of SDG 5, we have a target on economic resources and access to economic resources that World Bank is trying to measure, or try to propose that for it to be measured by access to credit or access to a bank account in a financial institution, which is a very different conceptualization of what access to economic resources is. So I think that I'm going to stop for now, but I look forward to keep the discussion with everyone.
Thank you very much. All right, we have actually covered many topics today, but it's good to have a kind of discussion, because I'm sure there are some contrary views about the economic growth, about environmental issues. So in this case, I want to ask Tony if you have any reflection on Fadhel and Timothée's talks.
Yeah, I mean, a very rich discussion. I mean, one problem, obviously, with economic growth, and I think Timothée put his finger on it, is, the material base is terrible. We're far, far away from anything like a circular economy. Am I going to see the circular economy in my lifetime? No. So we have a real problem there. We have a real problem with energy systems. And, there's a lot of discussion about industrial policy and manufacturing policy and so forth in development. But, you look at Africa and, the dominance of coal-fired power systems, not just Africa, but also, the developing world. And they're still being built. They're being built with debt, right? So, you can't have a green manufacturing system if it's basically being powered by coal. I think the G20 actually yesterday issued a statement in advance of the build-up to COP26, which failed to mention coal. But, we know also that China is in there, and India and so on. I mean, the International Energy Agency had a very interesting report a few months back specifically on India. And it's really actually quite frightening, the demand for energy in India as we go forward over the next 30 years, because a lot of the energy demand and also the materials demand is coming from stuff that's not yet built. So, that's an enormous issue. And, I think Timothée is right. We're very far off base. Just like to touch on this point that was raised. Sorry, is it? Do I pronounce it Magali?
Magali.
Magali. Sorry, yeah, Magali. I thought it was really interesting because I certainly think economists have been far too instrumental in the way they've approached gender. It's partly because when you're in a room with a hard-bitten finance minister and you're trying to make the case for educational investment and keeping girls in school, you kind of reach for those arguments. And, it's a classic example of the different interest and different perspectives that countries bring to the UN system. So, I live in the Nordic regions, and the Nordic donors are very, very strong, obviously, on gender equality in the UN system and women's rights and the whole rights initiative. But I would say, actually, we've come far from what I remember, it was like 30 years ago, including in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. I think on the data issue, yeah, you raised some quite interesting issues around the data, but it's really important to remember that even 30 years ago, the data was just absolutely terrible. I mean, it's not great now in some ways, but I remember in Africa in the 80s, there were programs, we were trying to design programs. We did not have the numbers. We didn't have the basic numbers. I remember there was a discussion, I went to Mozambique at the end of the war, and there was a discussion, the IMF was in town, and they had you'll probably like this story, they had a target for the fiscal deficit. And the fiscal deficit is basically, expenditures, government expenditures minus taxation over GDP. We had none of those three numbers. We didn't know what government expenditure was because the donors were funding a lot of it. We hadn't got a clue what tax revenue was because it was the end of the war. And we didn't know, there hadn't been a GDP number for about 10 years because the country had been in a civil war. We didn't even have a basic poverty number because, the country was just completely in flux. So if you go to I'm now with the Copenhagen group, now we have a lot of really interesting and, fairly objective numbers about the direction that Mozambique is going. And I think that's important because you've got to have accurate numbers there. And we can argue about, how you measure poverty and how you measure development. But, with at least some numbers that you can track over time, you can say to policymakers or you can say to aid donors, look, objectively, this is not the position. This is not the picture. Poverty is going up or poverty is going down, or poverty is much higher in this region than that region, right? So, but without the numbers, there's no objective basis. People can just say anything and they do, yeah? Which is what we see. So, yeah, sometimes, particularly the development economics crowd, we're obsessed with numbers, but there is, some sort of merit in there. And to their credit, the World Bank and the IMF have invested a lot more in numbers. And I don't think that example I quoted of Mozambique, you would actually see now in the IMF today. I think the point raised, the example of Bangladesh was really fascinating because, that is a country where you would not have expected much progress 40 years ago. And it has actually made a very large amount of achievement, partly down obviously to the civil society movement, BRAC and so forth, partly down to that export model of trade and clothing and textiles, which was put up in the graphic. I mean, a counterexample to that is Vietnam. Vietnam has very successfully moved itself up the global value chain to the point, at which, it is in reach with being quite a technological society. And that's an immense achievement. And you think about how Vietnam did it. Did it do under a capitalist system? Did it do it under a state capitalist system? Did it do under a central planning system? Fascinating question. I kind of, that's something that I think there's immense debate on, but you can't deny that, Vietnam has managed to take itself in that direction. So the conclusion I think that a lot of developing country leaders draw is there are a lot of problems in economic growth, but unless I achieve economic growth, I'm going to get kicked around in the world system, right? You want middle income status, you want upper income status, you want advanced economy status because, yeah, it's a power game ultimately. So selling them on limiting growth is hard. I mean, I tried this in the context of the oil sector because I work on the oil sector. And the story there is the ecological damage, the emissions and so forth. But they say, and I've no reason to doubt them, that they just do not see the promises of the advanced economies as credible. And, the promises of aid, climate finance, they do not see them as credible. And they say, look, Tony, we have elections to win. We're in democratic systems and our voters, they want to see an increase in incomes. And if I have to extract oil to do that, I'll do that. Which is a terrible position to be in. Yeah, that's where we are. Let me shut up for a moment and, let the others come in.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thanks a lot. Yeah, Timothée, please.
Yeah, I think the situation we have here is, the goal is not to advocate degrowth in the entirety of the world and to change kind of the rule of the global game, because this is not a global economy problem. All environmental pressures, they are concentrated in, when we look at consumption-based indicators, we can trace them down to income. They're correlated to income, so most of them are in the footprint of high-income nations. So they're the ones that have to degrow. So that's the question we have now. We have budgets, natural resource budget, not only a carbon budget, but everything else in nature is a set limited budget. The question is, in the current state of the world, do we want to use the remaining of that budget to just build infrastructure in the global south, so we can have pipes and schools and roads and power lines and whatever else you will? Or do we want to use that remaining budget in the global north to somehow try to produce and consume more stuff that we know empirically is already decorrelated from well-being? So for me, when I see that situation, I think, and here I come back to the SDG, like very clearly, SDG target number 1 of the 8, it says like sustained per capita economic growth in accordance with national circumstances. Here, I think that opens the door to that means in the global north, we actually need to decrease production and consumption in order to leave as much as of the available natural resource budget for the development of the global south. This is the big change I'm advocating. And for the circular economy, yeah, I'm afraid no one will ever see it, because a growing circular economy is impossible. We know from the numbers, GDP is coupled to material footprint. Actually, it's getting increasingly coupled. So having a growing circular economy is as impossible as trying to build a second international space station from the stuff you've recycled from the first international space station. It's not going to work. I've been playing with this argument for the last 5 years. I've never managed to hear an economist explaining me how a growing circular economy could work. So also here, we have to, of course, increase the circularity of our economies as much as we can, but that needs to go together with a macroeconomic strategies of sobriety. So to summarize, degrowth in the global north in order to give the best shot as having the greener growth in the global south. And again, not repeating the let's say the false promises of GDP obsession in the north, but actually in the global south to keep track of not economic growth per capita as a target in itself, but as a means of ensuring human well-being.
Thank you, Timothée. Yeah, Fadhel, please.
Well, just to add to this discussion a little bit, Tony, on your point about developing countries and the extraction of oil and the kind of the urgency of meeting the day-to-day needs of their population is understandable, which is why I zoom out of this process and I think of it from a global perspective. Because when you look at the $2 trillion number that I mentioned earlier, flowing in the wrong direction, and then you put it together with who's been the most responsible for climate change. We have the data since the Industrial Revolution. It's the global north. Who has the technological capabilities to mitigate quite a bit of the damage that we have? It's the global north. Who has the larger fiscal spending capacity? It's the global north. So we have to recognize that we need a form of climate reparations in the sense of literally repairing the damage, repairing the global financial and international trade system, and paying for it with financial resources, technological resources, and system redesign. So that's point number one. Point number two, to add to what Timothée was saying earlier, part of the process of degrowth and giving up the obsession with growth, including the extractive industries, is to change the metric. GDP growth is the wrong metric for all of these questions that we're looking at. And there's quite a bit of work that has been done. More work can be done in terms of developing alternative dashboards and metrics that focus on resilience, that focus on the actual ecological limits. And that's why I'm usually in favor of using, at a minimum, the closest cousin to GDP that gives us a better indication of quality of life and kind of suggests the alternative investment that we need to be looking at. And that is the genuine progress indicator, because I call it the closest cousin because it starts with GDP and then strips all the negative stuff out of it. It includes the right things that we need to focus on, including gender dimension, inequality dimension, but especially the ecological dimension. I mean, every time we clean up an oil spill, GDP goes up and it gets celebrated on TV as economic growth. Every time we see increases in, cancer cases and all of this negative stuff shows up and gets celebrated on TV by presidents and prime ministers as progress. When if we address the root causes of those problems, we have less economic growth in the narrow sense of the term, but better quality of life. So when you switch to a different kind of metric, it suggests that these are the kinds of investments that we need to put in place in order to increase our resilience, to increase our quality of life. And if that happens to produce economic growth in the narrow sense of the term, so be it, because it's more qualitative and it's more within the ecological limits, within the quality of life targets that we want to achieve, especially in the global south. So I've made the case for changing the metric. I've made the case for climate reparations. And if people want to go into the discussion of colonial reparations, because quite a bit of this extractive international trade and economic system is colonial and neo-colonial, and that also requires a form of reparations. And to me, reparations starts with acknowledging the problem, offering a public apology for the damage, and then repairing the damage, not just with financial compensations, because you can compensate all you want today and say we're set, but keep the same extractive engine in place, and in a decade or two, we'll be back on track for the same problems. So we need to repair the actual, replace the extractive model with a more resilient, sustainable, equitable model. And I'm happy to elaborate. I'm going to put in the chat a few links to short pieces that I've written on this discussion, if people are interested in it.
I will take it from there, I think, because it's a nice transition to go back to measurement, if that's okay. First of all, responding to Tony's comment, I think I totally agree. I think that the role of data and measures as a tool is not being challenged at all. What I'm taking issue with, I guess, is the role of data as a technology of global governance. And the reason why I do that is because I think that data tends to create kind of like this aura of like mystification and elite power that I think it's very problematic and at least needs to be addressed. For instance, one clear phenomenon that tends to happen when we discuss statistics and data, it's something that's called data inertia. That is that we tend to rely on what we already measure in the first place. And that's what happened with MDG 3, when women said like, oh, but if women had this opportunity because they were not at the table, but if they could say, oh, we actually care about all of these things, they would have heard, oh, but those are not measured. We don't know anything about that. So we're going to include only what we already measure. And of course, that what we already measure in the first place, it's related to what we already thought that was important. So it kind of creates a vicious circle that it is hard to move out of. And I think that has happened a lot with development. I mean, we have heard for many years that this idea of like a very expansive definitions of development, but then those ideas were mostly rhetorical, because when we look at how it was measured, most of those measures relied heavily on GDP growth. And those are what many countries ultimately look when making decisions, especially if there are either conditionalities or they're going to be judged for their performance on those indicators. And the other thing that happens in the realm of like data is what it's called expertise inertia, which is that those that already have experience are more likely to have a say in the final outcome. And this is what tends to happen with IFIs. And I would at least challenge the idea that IFIs necessarily know better how to measure either gender inequality or poverty or development of whatever than national statistics or even communities that might be experiencing some of those things in their everyday lives. So I think that it is important to kind of allow other voices that might not have the technical expertise or the infrastructure to have a say, an actual say in how things are measured and evaluated. And yeah, I mean, gender indicators have been like instrumental for kind of advancing many feminist demands, in particular in the field of economics. The idea of measuring unpaid care work has been very important to make that work visible. But at the same time, I think it is also important to acknowledge that many others have highlighted some of the let's say not drawbacks, but limitations of relying too much on those, in particular, how they tend to like conceptualize something that is very complex as a box ticking exercise, but also how they are usually created by global north and then used or deployed in the global south, or they tend to kind of reinforce like very colonial ideas of what gender equality is or what gender equality dimensions should be prioritized. And I think that just to wrap up, I think that the point that was lastly introduced about the importance of colonialism is something that crucial that we haven't touched upon sufficiently today. So I think like it would be good to take some time to reflect on that. I was actually reading recently some of the reports from the earlier UN conferences on women, and it really struck me how in the 70s and in the 80s, we had a lot of language that acknowledged like very explicitly colonialism and imperialism at the very roots of global inequality, and how those kind of demands have been de-radicalized throughout time. And I think that today, I think that those linkages, in particular, the responsibilities of global north countries in the situation of the global south have been kind of erased, and responsibility have been shifted towards the global south. Not to say that they don't have any responsibility, but I think it is an important first step to acknowledge their role as colonial and imperial powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magali. That's great. I have a question here, and myself has a question also regarding the concept of dual development. You know, Fadhel talked about changing the measures, changing the metric, and Timothée also talked about degrowth. The issue at the moment we have is that for example, if you look at OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, some oil-rich countries, they have two different kind of system, two different kind of institution. One of them is very developed. For example, if it is related to oil industry, is very developed. Some other institutions or some other parts of the economy is not developed because they are not actually, there is no demand for their products. You know what I mean? So if global north try to decrease their consumption and bring the growth down, it has a direct impact on global south as well. Because, for example, Bangladesh provides some textiles for other countries, specifically for developed economies. So in that case, how do you consider the impact of this degrowth on the global south? Anyone?
I'll just say it in one sentence. Fadhel has already said it. Look at the financial flows. They're net from south to north. to whatever is happening right now is benefiting the North at the expense of the South, double expense, financial expense and environmental expense. So yeah, of course, decreasing production and consumption in the North is going to decrease some of the importation revenue, but that needs to be matched with some cancellation of debt, change in patterns of foreign aid, change in rules of World Trade Organization to take into account certain social and environmental costs. So we have to have all these changes coming in parallel.
Yeah, but at the same time, what can we do about unemployment in the global South, if the unrest in the global South? Is there any solution? Do you think degrowth provide a solution for that kind of issues?
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss this. So this really has to do with the changing composition of production and employment as a result. So I'll start with an example in Tunisia. Tunisia has a Ministry of Agriculture, but not an agricultural policy that really prioritizes food security, because that's what you would want your Ministry of Agriculture to do. And the example is the following. Tunisia is a net importer of wheat, which is a basic crop for many countries actually in the Middle East. And yet we dedicate the most fertile land, the most precious and scarce water resources to producing things like strawberries. And we subsidize it because it's an export commodity, because the Ministry of Finance and the central bank are obsessed with euro and dollar revenues. And it just so happens that strawberries are in high demand in Europe because of the climate that we have in Tunisia and so on. So what we're talking about is reorganizing your domestic productive capacity and employment capacity and strategies to prioritize resilience and food security in this case, and renewable energy security in other cases. So what you want is to reallocate some of those precious resources to producing more food security. But the current situation, what do we have? We have exports of strawberries and imports of wheat from Russia, the Ukraine, the US, and so on. And when you face when global prices and those markets are working against you, you have food riots the next morning, or you have increasing external debt. And then you have the next stage of the external debt, which is the IMF saying you need to reduce spending on health and education and all the strategies that will give you resilience, that will help us address the challenges. So it's really about redesigning the strategies of economic development in the global South. And as Magali said, we're not trying to invent anything new. A lot of these strategies were on the table in the 1960s and 70s and were shut down by the global North. Let's remember that most of the developing world, Tunisia and Africa in particular, were the food baskets, the bread baskets of the global North during the colonial times. The very first thing the European Union did was to pass the CAP agreement, which is the Common Agricultural Policies, which was designed specifically to destroy agriculture in the global South and to destroy food security in the global South. Today, Africa imports 85% of its food, the most fertile land on the planet. And it's by design, it's not by accident. Of course, climate change makes things worse in recent years, but it's not the root of this problem. This was by design, a global North strategy to weaken the global South. So that's why I insist on colonial and neo-colonial reparations as part of this conversation, that market solutions to this and more free trade agreements are not going to resolve these problems. And of course, climate change is making it impossible to ignore these issues. And then finally, I want to say one thing about the oil industry and the extractive industries that Tony referenced earlier. I'd like to encourage all of us and people who are listening here to take a look at a global movement that I'm proud to be part of. It's called the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. It's an initiative, it's not a treaty yet, but it's gained tremendous support from many cities around the world, many NGOs and even some diplomats around the world. The idea is to end fossil fuel extraction. It can't be off the table. And unfortunately, This is still not part of the climate change negotiations. It's not part of the solution. And when you look at the treaty initiative, we're not ignoring the idea of just transition for workers in the fossil fuel industries, for all the other industries that will be decarbonized. But you can't just talk about just transition as empty promises and throw people under the bus. You have to have a strategic employment policy and resilience policy that is equitable, especially in the global south. Otherwise, countries that are hooked on this drug will resist and refuse until we run out of oxygen on the planet, essentially. There are serious discussions about redesign the global financial system, the energy system, the food system. We just need to build these coalitions and have these conversations on the bigger stages, because what's happening on the bigger stages, including climate negotiations, including UN discussions, including the so-called Great Reset, is really to change everything so that nothing changes. And we can't afford that at this point.
Thank you, Fadhel. We have some questions here. Just let me read one of them. It's often been mentioned that if we price climate change correctly, then incentives would align towards stopping climate change. What do you think is the reason behind why this doesn't work? Is it mainly an issue with getting the price to reflect climate risk, or more of a systemic issue with capitalism? Who wants to answer this question?
Well, I could have a go. I think it's an important question, because it takes us back to the point that Timothée was making earlier about the global carbon budget. And to a degree, actually, if you were going to try and ensure that the North was going to take more than its share of carbon reduction, he would very much go for carbon taxation and carbon pricing that's greater in the North than in the South. By the way, we have a question around whether China is considered to be part of the South still, because China is just, you know, massive entity. And China actually has just introduced a national carbon market, having experimented at a local level, I think, just this month. So I don't think the evidence is that carbon taxation or carbon pricing isn't working. There's an argument that it isn't being tried enough yet. I mean, there are critics of it, and indeed, you know, I think you can't just rely on pricing and taxation of carbon to get the outcome you want. You're going to have to introduce some regulation as well, quite intensive regulation. I mean, one of the attractions of carbon taxation is that to a degree you can change the fiscal base of the economy or the revenue base and move the revenue base away from as much taxation as we have on, say, income or indeed profit towards carbon. So to a degree, carbon taxation actually has a constituency of supporters among conservative economists as well as more progressive economists. Just on the issue, though, just coming back to this point about the overall global carbon budget, I wouldn't like to leave the audience with the impression that I disagree ethically with Timothée or Fadhel on this issue. You know, it is my strong belief that, you know, the advanced economies, you know, are immeasurably responsible for the situation we find ourselves in because of the historical emissions of carbon. And indeed, as I just said, should bear most of the brunt of carbon reduction. But what really does concern me, and I'm still struggling for the answer, is the politics around this. What are going to be the politics in the advanced economies that make our politicians deliver on this? Because until they are seen to deliver, then politicians in the South will come back to this credibility problem that I raised earlier, that they do not believe that they will receive more finance or aid or reparations, what you wish to call it, and will proceed along the way. Now, when they say that, I also say there is enormous risk for you sticking with oil and gas, partly because of the collapse in the price of renewable energy generation, But also, frankly, as carbon taxation and carbon pricing comes in, many of the smaller oil producers, particularly those in Africa, are basically going to find that their oil and gas is stranded because they have high costs and also high emissions. That's true actually also of Venezuela. So, we're going to see an enormous fallout. That goes back to the question that Fadhel raised about the transition. Economists like to talk about steady state versus the adjustment costs. Almost like, adjustment is just kind of, yeah, we kind of get through that in a few years. But the adjustment to this new system is going to be politically and economically dynamite.
Thank
Can
you
I
very
make
much.
a little
Thank you very
point
much. Yeah.
very quickly, say that there's a difference between carbon taxation and carbon pricing. So I think, of course, right now we need to have a rising price on carbon. I just don't think taxation is a good way of doing this. When we think about just pricing carbon, I can think of at least three systems. You can put a carbon tax, like it's the case in a few countries, like Sweden, famously with their tax above 100 euros per ton. You can organize a cap and trade system, like Tony was talking about China, and like the one we have in Europe, where you have a fluctuating price based on supply and demand. Or you can have a third system, which is often referred as cap and share, which is unlike cap and trade, where you can have, let's say, flexible cap. So it's not very a real cap. It's the cap and trade we have in Europe. It's closer to a carbon taxation because the cap is just always moving. In the cap and share system, you would just, have a carbon budget, let's say for France, divide it into carbon allowance. Some you give as unconditional carbon allowance to individuals, other you just auction to institutional users like companies and government. And then you let them perhaps just exchange on a secondary market with the government having price controls. And with, of course, the number of these permits, carbon permits, never exceeding the cap. Here you have a pricing system that is actually way more effective in limiting emissions, because if we look at the history of carbon taxation so far, it's not been very convincing. But then let me use that opportunity to make a little comment, because it's rethinking economics after all. I was noting when Tony earlier was talking about like economics being a little bit narrow in the last decade. So I just, my feeling of, I've studied economics for the last 12 years, bachelor, master's, PhD, and I mean, economics is a dry, barren land, it's embarrassingly unimaginative. It is so dull and boring that it makes me want to be a sociologist. And, I do love studying the economy. So I think here, I'm saying this because every single time we discuss climate change, there's always someone that's going to be like, oh, it's enough to tax carbon. So like that's the single solution we have, in economics. So here I'm just making a call for just, and I'm glad Rethinking Economics is organizing this event for just a broad call to pluralism. What is pluralism is basically broadening our toolbox of theories, of methods, of concepts, so that we have more solutions. Sometimes taxation is good, other times quotas are better, other times we can make an hybrid, and other times we actually invent new institutions. But for that, we first need to ask ourselves the question. Perhaps the Stern and Oswald study from 2019 that has looked how many papers were focusing on climate change in the top 9 journals in economics. Answer, 57. Out of 77,000. So that's 0.074% of papers look at climate change. So basically no economist has been looking at climate change. And when they do, very often it's from a neoclassical perspective, and they will just tinker the models with carbon taxation like William Nordhaus. So here right now, we really need to invest in our capacity to imagine. Tony was talking about it, the shaping, and Fadhel as well, like the structure of the economy, to reinvent modes of production and consumption that have just not existed or that have just disappeared for a long time. And also that's my last point also on transfer of technology. The problem is not just, rich companies, capitalist companies from the north is creating technologies to be sent to the south. I think in learning how to shape new, more sustainable modes of production and consumption, we have much more to learn from the global South than we think. So there needs to be transfer of institutions from the global South to the global North in order to inspire more frugal post-growth economies, in the same way that, of course, needs to be technological transfers from the global North and financial transfers from the global North in the form of reparations to the global South.
Surely, we need to change our mentality, but at the same time, we are trapped in the kind of zero-sum mindset that I have to win, so someone around the world should lose something. We have this idea in the trade balance, we have this idea even in economic growth. We have to change this idea, but there are lots of pressure from different nations against that one. And you saw that one in United States. They elected Trump because of this kind of nationalistic kind of way, the nationalistic kind of view about economic growth. So what can we do with the people in these countries to tell them, okay, you have to change your mentality about economic growth, you have to change your mentality about unemployment, and we need to focus on more collective kind of ideas, more human way of economic growth. So in this case, what could be done by economists or by political leaders or by anyone to actually promote these type of idea?
Well, if I may comment here, I mean, to start the process, you have to acknowledge that the existing path is unsustainable, and unfortunately, many political leaders don't recognize this. And I just dropped the link to the production gap, which is the gap between what the fossil fuel industry is planning to extract and burn by the end of the century, relative to what we're actually allowed to burn and extract in order to meet the climate challenge by the end of the century. And that gap needs to be closed. And every oil and gas executive, every prime minister, every president signing documents approving the additional construction of pipelines and oil and gas infrastructure is essentially signing on our behalf a collective suicide pact. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars as we speak of additional infrastructure, oil and gas extractive infrastructure, that's taking us way beyond what the production gap suggests we need to be at. So that's point number one. You can't say we care about climate change, we care about inequality, we're trying our best, and at the same time build additional extractive infrastructure. And at the same time, you're literally building stranded assets. And when you look at pension fund systems all over the world, especially in the global north, when you look at university endowments and all of these retirement funds, they're packed with stranded assets that are going to blow up in the next couple of decades. When you're looking at the impact of the climate crisis, not just in the global south, but also in the global north, not just financially, but in terms of what we would call climate refugees, with rising sea levels. These are massive economic, political, social consequences that are not going to happen in 100 years. They're happening as we speak, and they're going to accelerate in the next decade or two. Don't take my word for it. Look at the World Bank reports on climate impact on migration, especially in the global south. And the World Bank is not your club of tree huggers. And the numbers are astonishing. These are conservative numbers. So we can't really, play a double game here, say we care about climate change and we keep pushing the system in the same direction. So acknowledging this is number one, and then having a serious conversation about how do we unwind these things? How do we unwind the production, as the production gap suggests, and do this in a fair and equitable way for millions and millions of workers who will be displaced from the fossil fuel related industries all over the world, especially in the global south, where you have countries that depend 60, 70, 80, 90% of their economic activity is directly tied to oil and gas industries and other extractive industries. So we have to have an immediate plan to transform those economies into more resilient and equitable and decarbonized economies. That's where the conversation has to start immediately. You mentioned Saudi Arabia earlier, which is one of the countries that's heavily dependent on this. At the current path, Saudi Arabia will be a net importer of oil by 2038 or 2040, and there's some reports that were produced on this. So Saudi Arabia is finally recognizing it needs to diversify its economy away from oil. Well, guess what the next industry on the table is? Tourism. Like, that's going to be the solution, right? So we have to think beyond the traditional solutions that I mentioned earlier, which look like solutions of diversification, but they're fundamentally traps that continue this divide that we have between the global south and the global north.
Thank you very much. What about the political elements here? Do we need to think more about peace than war? Because there is one question here which says, is it possible to solve our economic problems without war, peace? Tony?
Yeah, I was just unmuting myself. So the question was basically, can we avoid major wars to get through, to take us through the next few decades? Well, I think it was a UN Secretary General who said that, the purpose of the UN is not necessarily to take the world to heaven, it's to stop it descending into hell. So you think about, the foundation of the UN in the closing years of the Second World War, and then, obviously in the decolonization and so forth, right through the 40s, 50s and 60s. I think we're at a very tense geopolitical moment. On the one hand, we expect China and the United States to cooperate, particularly around the climate agenda. We need that to happen. At the other point, we obviously have a geopolitical struggle in a new form. And then, one of the many problems with that is the fallout for the poorer countries of the world. They get squashed in the middle. We saw that, in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West from the 40s to the 90s. So that's a big worry. But in addition to that, we have multiple conflicts and wars going on already. Afghanistan, the Sahel, Ethiopia. Fadhel mentioned the situation in Tunisia, which develops overnight. Haiti, South Africa. COVID is driving societies, many of which have deep structural inequalities in ways that, are very, very unpredictable. So, whenever people have said to me, why do we need a United Nations system? I said, well, the UN works on all of these great things like development and human rights and now climate change and so forth. But fundamentally, it's there to stop or help to stop, the world descending into hell, which when I grew up was thermonuclear war between the United States, NATO, and the Soviet Union, its allies. So I really do worry about the tensions that we do now see in the struggle, particularly between the United States and China, because this is a moment where we need enormous amounts of international cooperation, as the pandemic has demonstrated, as COP26 has demonstrated.
Thank you very much. Timothée and Fadhel and Magali, do you want to add anything here?
Just very briefly, that I think it's also very important to kind of advance understandings of peace that go beyond conflict. And I think that we really need a much more ambitious idea of what it means to live peacefully and in an environment that allows you to realize your human rights. And I think that the UN has been very successful in many areas. And as I said, I see that the shift of power from the UN to other multilateral organizations is something to be very concerned with. But I do think that the UN has not been able to make enough progress in regulating corporate power, as we have seen with the idea of creating a binding treaty on business and human rights, but also with the rise of corporate power that we have seen in the last years, and how that has led to the capture of governments and also the cooptation of international spaces, which allows like these corporations to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner of their own rules. So I think that as long as we live in a world where some individuals have more wealth than entire countries, a world where these individuals have made their fortunes through, let's say, tax avoidance and evasion, through circumventing labor rights and exploiting people as cheap labor, through land grabbing practices that further impoverish indigenous peoples, and through extractive industries that affect the environment and harm the health of like local communities. I think it is really hard to think that that's how peace looks like.
Thank you, fantastic. Timothée and Fadhel.
Also, I mean, quickly, it's a beat up. It's an ecological beating, I think. It's we should not, treat the biocrisis as a world crisis of the Anthropocene. Is just a handful of multinationals, extractive corporations backed up by militarized government that are just benefiting a minority of wealthy individuals that have managed over decades to build a whole buffet of institutions to legitimate and enable their activity. So here, the beat up continues, and then, increasing the likelihood of conflict for all the rest of the world that have to live with the crumbs of wealth left behind and the enormous and rising amount of pollutions dumped on their faces. So now the question is, should we wait for world peace to do something about that? The answer is obviously no. We should just stop the beating. As simple as that. Stop the beating. This is not a political answer. And of course, it's an opening, but we should acknowledge that there is a beating, and then we should find a way to stop it.
Fantastic. And Fadhel?
Very little left to say. I completely agree with my colleagues here. I'll just close by saying we need to stop listening to the G7 and the G20 and start listening to the V20, the most vulnerable, climate vulnerable countries, because they're on the front lines of the problems. And I dropped a link here. The V20 is now 48 countries, and it's actually more than that, climate vulnerable countries. It's ultimately the global north is also vulnerable to a lot of these problems. So giving up the old, like many people have said before, repeating the same thing over and over again and hoping for better results is a definition of insanity, right? I think Einstein is this is attributed to Einstein, and this is essentially what we're doing. This mad belief in extractivism and economic growth for its own sake, that it's going to solve all of our problems is insanity. And I think our discussion today in terms of rethinking the economic ideas behind those policies is foundational. And as I said earlier, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have a lot of these strategies in place. They just happen to be not convenient for a very tiny global minority that Timothée just mentioned, the wealthy and powerful and the militarized elites who want to deny the rest of us a more equitable, just, and prosperous society. So a better world is within reach. I'm not a pessimist. I know we can achieve this, but not with the existing engine that we have for the global economy, and not with the existing global balance of power that's driving us off to the cliff.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think we have reached to the end of the session. Is that correct, Gustavo? Okay, so thank you very much, all of you. Really, it was really fruitful and enjoyable discussion around the global sustainable development and the future of the global economy. We had a variety of topics to discuss in this session. And I hope all people, our audience are enjoyed. And hopefully we will have another kind of event next year. Perhaps until 2030, we can have every year one session about global sustainable development to actually find out if we have reached or if we are closer to those goals or not. But anyway, it was a really good session, and thank you all very much for your contribution. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you.
See you. Bye-bye. Bye. Fadhel, can I talk to you just for a second? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, cheerio.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much.
It was very nice
Thanks.
to meet you, Tony. Yeah.